Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting shortly. We'll just wait a few more minutes for more participants to enter the webinar. Please ensure that the volume on your speakers is turned up. If you're having difficulty with your speakers, there is an option to call in and use your phone audio. If you use your phone audio, please make sure that your phone is muted so that we can cut down the background noise. If you're joining using computer audio, your audio will automatically be muted. If anyone has questions during today's presentation, you can type them into the question box at the bottom right-hand side of the control panel, and we will be sure to get to your questions at the end of the presentation. If you're having difficulties with sound or would like the presenter to slow down, you can also communicate that either through the chat box or through the question box. If you're viewing the webinar today from a computer with dial-up internet, you may experience some delay in the audio or with the slides. If we run into a delay with the webinar, please stay online and the host will reconnect. While we wait to begin, we have a series of trivia questions for you to test your knowledge on alternative feeds. To access the quiz, please go to menti.com and enter the user code that you can see on your screen. For those who have just joined us, welcome to today's webinar on a common sense approach to understanding alternative feeds. I'll remind anyone who is joining using phone audio to please mute your audio so that we reduce the background noise. If you're joining using your computer audio, you will automatically be muted. On your screen, you should see a quiz rating your alternative feed knowledge. In order to participate in the quiz, please go to menti.com and enter the user code that you can see on your screen. We'll be beginning today's presentation in just a few minutes. So if you're joining us now, please take the opportunity to rate your feed knowledge. We have a couple of more questions for you, so we'll go on to the next question. Which of these feeds is likely to be high in sulfur? And it looks like everyone has chosen the correct answer. That's right, canola hay. Our next question, which conditions can lead to nitrate accumulation? Drought, hail, frost, or all of the above? And again, thanks to those who participated, the correct answer is all of the above. Last question, which values on a feed test indicate the fiber content of the feed? And again, everyone did a great job. Acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber. At this time, I am going to turn the webinar over to Adrian Good to introduce today's speaker.
Right, like Chelsea said, my name is Adrian Good. I'm a livestock and feed extension specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture based out of Moose Jaw, and I'll be facilitating the webinar today. And of course, today's topic is a common sense approach to feeding alternative feeds with Dr. John McKinnon. Dr. McKinnon is a professor emeritus in the Department of Animal and Poultry Science at the University of Saskatchewan. During his tenure at the university, he occupied the Saskatchewan Beef Industry Chair, an industry-funded position that focused on extension and research related to beef cattle. His research interests included growth and carcass quality of beef cattle, as well as on the feeding value of byproduct feeds in cow-calf and finishing programs. To date, he has authored or co-authored more than 130 peer-reviewed papers in scientific journals. A member of the Saskatchewan Institute of Agrologists since 1988, John has worked with beef producers throughout Canada through public speaking, the Western Canadian Feedlot Management School, the Saskatchewan Beef Symposium, and a monthly column in the Canadian Cattleman's Magazine. John graduated from the University of Manitoba, obtaining a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture. After a stint as a cattle buyer, he enrolled in graduate studies at the University of Saskatchewan, where he obtained his master's and PhD. His research and extension activities have been recognized by the University of Saskatchewan, the Beef Cattle Research Council, and the Canadian Society of Animal Science. In 2013, he was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for service to the Canadian cattle industry. Presently, John operates a nutrition consulting company that works with cow-calf and feedlot producers across Western Canada. So John's presentation is up and ready and to go. So go ahead, John, and begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you for everybody that's out there for giving up a little bit of time over lunch to listen to the seminar here today, which, as Adrian indicates, is a common sense approach to feeding alternative feeds. Just make sure everything's going here. So I guess the first thing I'll start off with here is, why the interest in alternative feeds, and certainly, at least from my perspective, I'm seeing a lot more interest in some of these byproducts that are out there than what I've seen in the past. And I think one of the big driving issues is just that when we look at the grain, the pulse, the oilseed processing sectors, there's been a move across Western Canada to value-added processing within the provinces, whether it's ethanol, whether it's pulse processing, oat processing, canola processing. These are all generating, value-added economic activity in terms of selling a processed product. And out of these industries comes byproducts. And that is certainly one of the driving forces, is we just see a lot more supply of different types of byproducts that are out there. This increase in supply certainly is leading to an increase in the number of operations that you see where alternative feeds are becoming a basis of the nutrition program. And I see it in cow-calf operations, I see it in backgrounding operations, and not to the same extent in finishing operations, but when you look at finishing operations, the medium to the larger ones, they're all using byproducts for protein supplementation. So these alternative feeds are coming pervasive across the industry, and again, a lot of it's due to supply and a lot of it's due to pricing. The third area that certainly drives interest as well is just use of these products as an emergency feed supply during drought years. And people are saying we're seeing increasing frequency and severity in drought, and maybe that's due to climate change, maybe it's just due to unfortunate luck, who knows. But certainly there's people in central Saskatchewan that have seen dry years for the last 4 years, and we can go back farther than that, where we've got some pretty severe drought where we've had to look for alternative feeds. A lot of the hardest hit feed sources in drought years is is some of our hay crops, our cereal straw. They're scarce commodities. At the best of times, it seems like expensive and scarce, and in drought years, it's even worse. So when you put those three things together, that's certainly part of the reason why we're seeing much more interest in these feeds. So I'm going to talk about some of the different types that are out there, but I maybe just want to come back to the first part of the topic here, that being a common sense approach to feeding these products. My wife sort of laughed at that a little bit. She doesn't think I have too much common sense, but I'll try to give you what I've got. And when it comes to looking at developing feeding programs, whether it's in drought years, whether it's in good years, whether we're using traditional feeds or alternative feeds, I think what we have to remember, we need to practice sound feeding management. We have to target the nutrient requirements of the cattle. Those requirements include maintenance requirements to keep the animal alive. They include production needs for pregnancy, for lactation, and for growth. And so we need to make sure that no matter the environment that we're feeding in, that we're targeting the appropriate nutrients for the appropriate phase of production. This practice sound feeding management certainly encompassing balancing available feed resources with cattle numbers, ensuring that we have feed tests available on feeds and supplements so that we can maximize the use of local feedstuffs that you're growing on your farm or on your ranch, and that when you do have to go out and buy either alternative products or supplement products, that you're not spending money wastefully. You're making sure through that feed test that you're maximizing the local use of your feedstuffs. You want to make sure we're balancing the rations for protein and energy, and ensure that the appropriate mineral and vitamin supplement is provided for the stage of production those animals are in. We also want to remember that as we go through the year, the reproductive calendar of that cow, that her needs change, and that there are two critical periods: the last trimester of pregnancy, so the last 60 to 90 days of pregnancy, and from calving through to grass or through the breeding program. We want to make sure we minimize the decline in body condition in these periods, targeting nutrient requirements for development of that fetus, as well as for milk production, and ensuring we don't lose condition after calving. So that's really important. And that just really means that when we start looking at our cows at this time of the year, with a lot of them are out still grazing, hopefully they're in good condition. Most of those cows are likely in mid-gestation now, and relatively low requirements in terms of their nutrient requirements. We can get away with relatively cheaper feeding at this time of the year than we can as we move into late pregnancy, post-calving, and the feeding of replacement heifers and growing calves. So again, we just want to make sure that we're practicing sound feeding management, no matter the type of program or the environment that we're dealing with. So when we look at the options that are out there for these alternative feeds, there is a wide variety of them. A lot of them are coming out of the grain, the pulse, the oilseed sectors. So products such as grain, pulse, and oilseed screenings, oat hulls, pea hulls, meals such as canola meal, distillers dried grains with solubles, soybean meal would get included in here. We've got products like wheat midds, cull potatoes, barley sprouts. You know, there's a wide variety of byproducts that are coming out of this value adding of the grain, pulse, and oilseed sectors. Depending on the year, we're going to have salvage crops. 2021, we dealt a lot with canola hay, canola silage. I've seen people feeding lentil bales just because the crop failed and they baled it up in 2021. Drought years, we tend to see a lot of cereal green feed fed. but even in normal years, we can see cereal grain fed as well. And then we can have products such as sprouted grains and lightweight grain. So I can't cover all of these, but I'm going to try to go through a representative sample of them here this afternoon. Before I do that, again, when it comes to the successful use of these products, there's some really important concepts that you have to have in the back of your mind if you're going to particularly move from maybe a traditional feed source and start to think about bringing these products in on a year-round basis or have them form part of your winter feeding program. Probably the first one and most important one is when you look at the wide range of products I just showed you, there's tremendous variation in nutrient content between the different products. So the difference between oat hulls and distillers dried grains is the difference between night and day. It doesn't even compare, right? So there's a wide range between products, and there's also, or there can be a wide variability within given products, just depending on source, year, area of the country that you might be coming from. So I'll go into this a little bit more in a little bit. Pricing and consistency of supply is also critical. If you look at pricing, first of all, you can buy products such as oat hulls, for example, in the middle of summer where demand is very low. You can buy them much cheaper than you can at this type of the year where people are looking to bring that type of byproduct into their program. So pricing can vary with supply, and the consistency of the supply is so important if you're looking at developing a feeding program on these types of feeds. So there's no sense getting, for example, distillers grains in as a protein source if you can only get one load, and a month from there, either the price has gone up where you can't afford them anymore, or you just can't get the product. So you need to make sure you're dealing with these suppliers. People will sign contracts for delivery just to ensure that they know the price and they have that consistency of supply covered. Handling, storage, shrinkage can all be very important considerations. Again, oat hulls, if you're not careful, you can lose half of them to the wind if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Storage considerations in terms of high moisture products going bad on you. Handling characteristics of these alternative feeds will vary. So you need to be able to understand the characteristics of these products and ensure you can handle them and store them in a safe manner. Anti-nutrient concerns, I'll go through this with some of the products as well, but mycotoxins, mold, ergot, dawn, these types of mycotoxins can be concerns with certain products. Sulfur, other mineral contamination can come into play as well as nitrates. So you have to keep all these issues in the back of your mind if you're looking at developing your feeding program on alternative feeds. So if we look at some of the industries that are out there, and I just want to give you a scope a little bit of the supply that's potentially out there. If we look at some of these industries where these byproducts are coming out of, as I said, they're generally byproducts of value-added processing of either grain, pulse, or oil seeds. So if you look at canola, we've thought of the canola industry as pretty mature industry. It's everywhere across Western Canada. We've got a number of plants that are out there, but we also see that there's a lot of expansion planned for this industry. So the canola sector is actually growing in Western Canada. Ethanol, oat sector are pretty stable, but there's plants across the Western Canada that are cleaning oats for human food consumption. There's plants that are producing ethanol and generating a lot of byproduct. Cereal grains are being cleaned across the three provinces, as well as peas and lentils. So all of these industries are generating a lot of byproduct. And let's look at a couple of them individually. So in 2022, canola, there's about 18 million tons in Canada, the majority of that grown in Western Canada. There's 6 major crushing companies, processing companies in Canada with 14 plants. 11 of them are here in Western Canada, so you can see that's really where the industry is centered. Those 11 plants generate 11 million tons of, or pardon me, the 14 plants generate 11 million tons of Canadian crushing capacity. And there's another 6 million or 7 million of them planned, or capacity planned. And a lot of that is centered in Saskatchewan here in Regina. So pretty significant crushing capacity. Canola meal represents about 60% of that crush. So that current crush of 11 million tons, 60% of that is basically canola meal. So that's about 6.5 million tons of canola that's available here in Canada. A lot of that is exported, but a lot of it is here or available for feeding in Western Canada as well. It's an excellent protein source. It's an intermediate protein source, and I'm going to show you some numbers here in a minute. But there's also some specialty canola meals that you can get out there that are processed in a different fashion, and they tend to be high in fat. So regular canola meal might be 2 to 3% fat, whereas this specialty meal can be upwards of 12 or 14% fat. So it's a high fat product and a high protein product, and if you have access to it, it can fit into a ration very nicely. So I'll come back to the specs on canola meal in a minute, but let's just have a quick look at ethanol production. So there's 14 Canadian plants with 7 in Western Canada. There's about 2.1 billion liters of ethanol produced in Canada. Sounds like a lot, but it pales in comparison to what's produced in the United States. Here in Canada, both plants are both corn and wheat based in terms of production of ethanol. And so it will affect the byproduct, whether these byproducts are coming from corn, whether they're coming from wheat, or they could be coming from a mixture of corn and wheat. And again, I'll show you some of the byproducts here in a second. If you look at Western Canadian ethanol production, these numbers go back to when the industry was being set up here a few years ago. And basically for each million liters of ethanol that's produced, you get about 1,000 tons of dried distillers grains. So if we look at, Husky Energy in Lloydminster and over in Manitoba at Minnedosa, so on both sides of it, basically, you get about 134,000 tons of dried distillers grains, roughly from those two plants combined, or from each plant. Terra Grains down in Belle Plains, roughly about 150,000 tons of dried distillers grains. Northwest Terminals at Unity would be about 25,000 tons. Other plants such as Poundmaker are private and consume all their product in-house. So you can see there's a significant volume of Western Canadian distillers grains that are produced, and this is not all of them, but we also have a significant amount of corn distillers grains that comes up into southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, into Manitoba as well from the US. So there is a significant volume of both corn and wheat distillers grains that are available for use here in Saskatchewan and in Western Canada. If we look at the nutrient content of these meals, and so I've got canola meal, I've got high fiber canola meal, or pardon me, the high fat canola meal, I've got wheat distillers grains and corn distillers grains. And what's important to recognize about the nutrient content of these products is they reflect the initial product or the initial grain or oil seed that's used in the process of creating the primary products such as ethanol, and as a result, the byproduct. So if we look at the crude protein content of all of these products, basically they're pretty good, anywhere from a low end of 28% with corn dried distillers grains all the way up to 40% with wheat distillers grains. So the corn distillers grains is basically the lowest, and you see there's a range of about 28 to 32. That would really reflect the processing of that corn during the ethanol production process and whether any fat or not is left in there. The higher fat, the lower the protein. The lower the fat, the higher the protein of the corn distillers grains. So anywhere from 28 to about 32, sometimes it sneaks up to 34%. The wheat distillers grains, pretty high because it's reflecting the crude protein content of wheat grains, so it's up there around 38 to 40. Regular canola meal is about 36 to 38% crude protein, and the high fat canola meal is just a little ways behind that, it's about 37%. If you move down and you look at the fat content, again, it reflects the process. So canola meal, regular canola meal, they extract all of the fat or as much as that they can. They're taking that fat or the oil out because that's what their whole point of processing it is. So they extract it with hexane, and it leaves about 2% fat or oil in the meal. The high fat canola meal is pressed, so it's not extracted with an oil. So you get about 12 to 15% residual fat in that meal. The wheat distillers, relatively low in fat, about 4 to 5%. And the corn, because corn grain is higher in fat than wheat grain, it is higher in the distillers grains as well. And it really just depends on the processing as to how much of it they take out. Recently, they're trying to take out as much as they can because they got alternative uses for it. So that gets reflected in the energy content of these meals. And you can see the canola meal is the lowest of the four, the regular canola meal, and then the high fat canola meal and the corn distillers grains has the highest TDN content, really reflecting the fat content that they're in those products. And the wheat at about 80 to 82% is basically about the same as barley grain in terms of its TDN content. The one other point to notice is the sulfur content of these products. Canola itself tends to be high in canola or in sulfur. And so when you look at these byproducts, you can have 0.6, 0.7% canola or sulfur in either the high fat or regular canola meal. And that's just a reflection of the process and the original canola grain or oil seed. With the distillers grains, sometimes sulfur gets added during the process, and that's just to control the fermentation. And so you can have all the way up to 1.2% sulfur in some of these distillers grains, just depending upon the plant they're coming from. So it's always important to have a feed test and to know that, because you want to be careful with high fat meals, because if you're putting that into rations, the higher levels of sulfur combined with sulfur levels in some of the base ingredients can lead to situations where we're looking at excessive sulfur levels in the total mixed diet that might include the sulfur in the water as well. And when that happens, there is the potential for issues with polio to come into play. So it's just something that you want to watch, and you want to watch the contribution of these meals to the total sulfur intake of the animals. And I'll just point out, all of them tend to be high in phosphorus as well. And again, that's just potentially an environmental issue. We want to watch how much phosphorus we're feeding to cattle, because a lot of it's just coming out the back end into the environment. So let's just move on. We'll look at oat processing. Again, just the scope of the industry. Richardson Milling is probably the big player in Western Canada. Numbers going back a couple of years, greater than 350,000 tons of oat being processed per year at their two primary plants here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The byproduct of that processing is the oat hull, or one of the byproducts. 25% of the kernel is the hull. So, we're dealing with a lot of oat hulls that are produced out of these two plants alone. And you look at other Saskatchewan sources like grain millers at Yorkton, Avena Feeds down in Regina, various grain brokers that are selling the product. There's a lot of oat hulls that are available for feeding, other uses as well, but most of it is used for feeding cows. And if we look at oat hulls nutritionally, they're similar to straw. They're low in crude protein. They're roughly 2.5 to 4.5% crude protein, so not much different than straw. High fiber products, so 40 to 50% ADF, so almost half of it is very fibrous in nature, and that's contributing to a relatively low energy content of 45 to 50% TDN. So really, when you think about what are these replacing in the diet, they're really replacing situations where we were feeding straw in the past, situations where we're trying to bulk up the feed, lower the energy density, trying to reduce our usage of products like silage and grain and some of our higher quality hays, where we don't have to feed as much of those products. We can bulk up that ration with a product like oat hulls. Some general guidelines that I use in terms of wintering rations for beef cows: 50% of dry matter intake is the upper limit that I use. In backgrounding diets, anywhere from 20 to 30%, but that's going to depend on my desired level of performance of the calves that are on those backgrounding diets. Remember, they're low in energy, right? So the more the inclusion rate of these products, the more you're going to restrict the net energy gain of the diet and restrict the performance of those calves. So you have to watch that. The point I'll point out here is cattle love to eat oat hulls. Their appetite always increases. It's just in contrast to straw, where you've got a higher or longer fiber length there. The high fiber nature with the high chop length to that straw basically will limit intake. The oat hulls are they're either processed coming out of the plant, or just by nature they're a small size product to them. They will have a high passage rate to them, and so you need to watch intake. I've seen people try to feed them free choice, and you can get into situations where impaction problems can crop up. So you want to watch that. They also don't handle well. They don't flow well. If you're not lucky enough to have someone deliver them in a bottom unloader, Super B shows up on your operation, well, that's a chore and a half to get that out of that truck. Just the nature of them. They're itchy as all heck, and they're not handled very well. Handling them in bulk is the way to do it. You want to keep them out of the wind if you want to keep your shrinkage down. Feed is part of a total mixed ration, again, coming back to some of those issues with intake. And if your ration is a bit on the dry side with them, add water if you can do it to reduce dust. I'll switch gears here and talk a little bit about grain and pulse screenings. So if we look again just at the size of the industry, I looked at the last 3 years, 2020 to 2022, and there was quite a variation in total tonnage of the grain and oilseed that was produced, and a lot of that's going to reflect the drought of the rather widespread drought of 2021. There was anywhere from 22 to 35 million tons of wheat in those 3 years produced, 14 to almost 20 million tons of canola, and 7 to 10 million tons of barley, and almost 3 to 5 million tons of oats. So when you look at this production of grain and oil seeds, and if we look at the move over the last number of years to cleaning here on the prairies, and if we look at a dockage of 2 to 3%, you can see that in both terms of the refuse screenings from the wheat side of things, and if we look at the canola screenings, there's the potential for a significant volume of both refuse screens and canola screens to be potential here for feeding in Western Canada. If you look at the pulse screenings last year, 2022, there was 2.3 million tons of lentils produced in Western Canada and 3.4 million tons of peas. The size of those two sectors relative to wheat or to the oil seeds is certainly small, but they're growing and certainly attracted the attention of processing. So this is a plant that's just come on stream in Manitoba. It's a French company called Roquette. They build this plant as the world's largest pea protein extraction plant. So basically what they're doing there is extracting pea protein for human food consumption. And then all of the byproduct that's left over is going into various sectors of the livestock industry. There's 3 potential products that come out of there, or this particular plant. One is pea hulls, the other is pea screenings, and then there's kind of a syrup that goes into the hog industry there. So I don't know how much of that product comes over this way, but when you look here in Saskatchewan, there is a variety of plants that are involved in processing in one way or another that have the potential to have products such as pea and lentil screenings, pea and lentil hulls that can come, that I've certainly seen in the last number of years in increasing frequency that are being used in these backgrounding as well as cow-calf operations that are forming the basis of the nutrition program. So again, there is a number of different sources that are out there, whether we're talking the grain screening side of things or the pulse side in terms of these potential byproducts. If we look at grain and pulse screenings, the raw screening side of it, people are purchasing them direct from terminals or direct from these processing plants or through brokers. In the case of processed grain screenings themselves, they are tending to be purchased directly from feed companies or from specialized pelleting plants, and we have a couple of them that are here in the province as well. When we look at what are grain screenings, basically they're chaff, and you can see that in the picture, lots of chaff, less than 15% shrunk broken kernels of the original grain source, whether it's oat or whether it's wheat or barley. A lot of weed seeds that contribute the fat content to the screenings that I showed you earlier. And there's a significant amount of dust. There's a significant amount of dirt that's in there as well. On the pea side of things, so pea screenings, for example, a lot of broken hulls, a lot of broken shrunken kernels, some weed seeds, some dust and dirt, but generally I find a lot cleaner product than what you see with refuge screenings from the grain side of things. In terms of nutrient content, I've put this together as examples of the different types of screenings that I've seen. I don't mean this to be an all-inclusive nutrient content or basically it's the range that I've seen, and what I'm showing you here, some of the numbers are based on different analysis or different numbers of analysis than others. So the refuge screenings, for example, you're probably looking at a dozen wet chemistry results that you see there in front of you. The canola screenings, there's about a half a dozen. The pulse screenings are about a half a dozen, and there's one flax screening. So I'm just telling you that so that you take this with a grain of salt, that this is not going to be the godsend, if you will, in terms of what the nutrient content of these different products are. This is just what I've seen in the last couple of years. So dry matter content is pretty specific, 85 to 90%. Crude protein varies the products that you see there. The refuge screenings, again, this, I've got about a dozen numbers in here, so anywhere between 13% and 18% crude protein. The canola screenings, not quite as high. And again, when you look at canola screenings, there is a pile of pods that are in there, right? And those pods are going to reduce that potential for protein, fat, etc., to contribute to the nutrient content of the entire screening. So about 12 to 14%. The pulse screenings pretty consistently at the higher end of all these products, anywhere from 17 to 25%. That one flax screen came in at 19%. The fat content of these products will depend either on weed seed content or on the content of immature canola seeds in the case of canola screenings, and in the case of flax screenings, immature flax seeds. So the fat content can be fairly high in canola screenings. In this one sample of flax screenings, it certainly was at 18%. The refuse screenings, about 3 to 8% is the range I've seen, and the pulse screenings tend to be lower at that 2.5 to, there was one upper one at 5.2 that was likely more weed seeds in there. And then when you move to the TDN content of them, again, it's going to vary with the products, but the refuse screenings, the canola screenings, pretty similar. That mid 60s to 70% TDN is typically the numbers that I look at. The pulse screenings are better. You see them anywhere from TDN of 70 to 78%, and they tend to be fairly consistent if you're getting them from one source. And that, in that case of the flax screenings, it certainly reflects the high fat content that you see there. So there is variation within these products. There is variation across the products depending upon the source that you're getting them from. The caveat that I want to put out here, what you're looking at here are the numbers that come back from wet chemistry from a feed testing lab, okay? And you have to remember that a lot of these numbers are going to be based on immature weed seeds, immature canola seeds, immature flax seeds, broken kernels that are not processed, okay? And when you look at the digestibility of these products, it's going to be influenced by these small seeds that have the potential to go through the animal untouched. And that just shows up some work that we did a number of years ago at the University of Saskatchewan. Steve Pilot ranches up at Meadow Lake these days. His master's work looked at the intake and digestibility of processed and unprocessed canola screenings. So what he did, he had an animal feeding trial where he was feeding these cattle every day, recording what they ate. He was collecting total fecal output from these animals and looking at the difference between what they ate and what they excreted to come up with digestibility estimates. And the first thing, if you look at there, the dry matter intake of these animals, the unprocessed screenings was significantly higher than the processed screenings. So when the screenings were processed, they ate significantly less than when they were unprocessed. Why? Well, all you have to do is look at the digestibility characteristics of the unprocessed screenings. They were digested 10% poorer in terms of dry matter, 10% poorer in terms of crude protein. The TDN content of the unprocessed screenings was only 55.5% versus 69%. Basically, they were not utilizing the unprocessed screenings to the extent that they were using the processed screenings. So again, you just have to remember when you get an analysis back on these products, you have to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, and you have to think about how much should I be discounting these products to actually determine or to get closer to what the animal is actually going to utilize. When you look at processing, you can see particularly at some of these processing plants, they're looking at rolling, grinding to get a physical reduction. That's difficult on farm. Most roller mills, it's too difficult to get a roller setting that will touch some of these smaller seeds. And in terms of some of the higher content products where you might have higher content of some of these seeds, you can gum up a roller mill pretty quickly because of the fat nature of them as well. Grinding would certainly be an excellent way of getting a physical reduction and to allow access to the interior of some of these smaller weed seeds to get enhanced nutrient utilization. So when you look at some of these processing plants that are pelleting these products, you can see this physical reduction to get access, as well as the steam that's generated during pelleting that can allow access, greater access to the interior of the seed itself in terms of weed seeds and immature canola seeds, etc. There are products out there such as fortified grain screenings that are combining refuse screenings with barley, wheat, lentil screenings, etc. that are coming up with a more consistent product in terms of nutrient content to reduce that variation. You can combine the grain screenings with some of the more traditional feed sources, add calcium and phosphorus supplements, add trace minerals, add the vitamins, add an ionophore to have a complete product that you can really have a convenient way of delivering protein, energy, and minerals and vitamins to the cattle, all in a pelleted form. So those are available for commercial purchase as well. The big caveat that I want to bring out, particularly with respect to grain screenings that are arising, from the wheat, the rye, barley sectors, is the potential for mycotoxins, and in particular, the potential for ergot contamination. There has been issues over the last 10 years where grain screenings have been fed both in the raw as well as in the pelleted forms, where ergot was not checked going in and big wrecks occurred. And nobody wants to see that. So make sure that if you're feeding these types of products, that ideally you're working with your feed company or your feed source, or you're working with a nutritionist to ensure that there's testing that's going on for ergot. Visual evaluation in grain screenings is not good enough. You have to have a laboratory analysis. Just move on to some of the salvage crops, and I'm just quickly going to go through these. If we look at canola hay and silage, again, this year I haven't seen much of it, but certainly in 2021 we saw a lot of it. If we look at canola cut for either hay or silage, basically late bloom through mid potting stage, we can get pretty good hay, we can get pretty good silage. The hay can almost be equal to alfalfa grass hay in terms of 15% protein, 60% TDN. The difficulty cutting for hay or even for silage is getting to dry down that hay or silage, so we can either put it up at the right moisture content or we can bale it at the right moisture content. But if we can do that, we can get a pretty decent hay or silage crop out of it. Some of the feeding issues you can get into with these salvage crops coming out of the canola sector is pelletability. Certainly canola straw, it's pretty fibrous, pretty brittle type straw. Pelletability can certainly be an issue there. But even with hay and silage, cattle have to get a bit of a feel for it. Nitrates can certainly be an issue, so we want to watch that and have a test on that. And I mentioned that earlier with respect to the meal. Sulfur levels can be an issue too in these products, and so we want to make sure that we do a feed test, we get a sulfur content of that hay or silage, and we look at total sulfur intake of those animals to see whether we're dealing with the potential for polio or even the potential for tying up trace minerals. If we look at, and I'm just going to skip here, if we look at off-grade grain, this is an area where we see a lot of interest in, and it just varies depending upon the year. In some years, we just can't get the grain off at the right stage. You know, it's swath, but we get rained on and sprouting occurs, so we can get a lot of potential product that way. Drought years or frozen years where we get early frost, we get lightweight grain arising out of that situation. And so just depending upon the year, we can get either lightweight grain or we can get sprouted grain. And so the potential is there to purchase it or to utilize it. The questions I always get is, you know, if I know the price of 48-pound barley and I'm getting offered some of this off-grade grain, you know, how much can I discount it for? And, you know, really there's two discounts that come into play. There's one is particularly in higher moisture grain is the discount that has to be applied for the high moisture content so that you're buying the same amount of dry matter. And then there's a nuisance factor that has to come into play as well. How do you store that product to ensure that it's not going to go bad on you? So you have to think about those two things, the nutrient value of it, as well as the nuisance value of you having to store it. A lot of the issue with this off-grade grain really comes down to low test weights, okay? And what is the feeding value of 44 or 45-pound barley relative to my 48-pound barley? So if we look at normal test weights for the typical cereal grains that we see out there, you know, 48 pounds for barley, 60 for wheat, 56 pounds for corn, 34 pounds for barley. If we look at a lot of the research that's been done, a lot of it was done a number of years ago in Manitoba. A lot was done in the northern states, Nebraska, for some of these, particularly corn, looking at the feeding value of lighter weight grain. The critical weights that come out of a lot of that weight is, for example, with barley grain, about 43 pounds. So what I mean is by critical weights there, if we look at the performance of cattle fed 48 pounds versus 47 pounds versus 45, 44-pound barley, what we typically will see is the performance of those cattle in terms of average daily gain will hold. They'll gain the same. But what will happen is they have to eat more of that lighter weight barley, say 45-pound barley. They'll have to eat more of it to get the same gain. So you'll start to see your feed efficiency start to slide on you. But once you get down to a critical situation of 43 pounds or less, then everything starts going out the window. Gains drop, feed efficiency drops, and that value of that grain becomes much more circumspect, right? So if you can buy this lightweight grain as you go down from 48 down to about that 44-pound mark, just remember your feed efficiency is going to start to suffer. Your gain should stay the same. So you have to think about that when you're looking at pricing that lighter weight grain. And the same comments would apply for wheat, corn, and barley as you go down. The other issue, particularly with some of the higher moisture grain that might be out there, is you do want to check for mold and microtoxin analysis in that type of a situation. Just the last two slides I'm going to put up would be byproducts that are out there of the grain milling sector. One of a favorite of mine is wheat midds. I like feeding wheat midds. They seem to be a nice way to start calves. I find them very good for wintering cows. The biggest issue with them is, can you buy them at the right price, and are they available in terms of a consistent supply? They're available through brokers primarily. They're a byproduct of the wheat milling sector. You know, again, there's a little bit of variation in their nutrient content, but they're pretty consistent in terms of crude protein, anywhere from 14 to 18%. They're just the nature of them because of the, you know, they're shearing off the bran sector of that kernel. They're relatively high in fiber, but it's a relatively digestible fiber. So they're not an energy source that you see with wheat, for example, but they can be an intermediate energy source, somewhere around that 76, 78% TDN. And so they do fit nicely into these wintering cows backgrounding diets if you need some energy supplementation. The other sector here would be malt sprouts that come out of sort of the grain milling side of it. This would be more the malting sector. You don't see the availability of these products like you do with wheat midds or some of the other products I've talked about, but they are out there. You know, they're generated from malting barley. The rootlets, the sprouts, the hulls are separated out in the malting fermentation process. Just the nature of them, they're high in protein, anywhere from 18 to 24%. Again, an intermediate energy source, maybe not as good as the wheat midds, but they can work very nicely in terms of a supplement for wintering cows as well as for backgrounding calves. So I just want to conclude and leave a little bit of time here for questions. Again, coming back to that title of a common sense approach, I think we really need to think about whatever the environment conditions we're faced with in terms of putting together rations for the backgrounding sector, for the cow-calf sector, or even the finishing sector. We need to feed balanced rations for the type of cattle that we're finishing. We want to target their nutrient specifications. That includes for maintenance as well as for production. So we want to feed a balanced ration. We want to make sure we feed test to get the most out of the feeds that we're producing at home, and then to minimize what we have to bring in terms of supplemental feed. Allocate that feed that varies in quality according to stage of pregnancy, lactation, and growth. That's really important for the cow-calf sector, for the bred heifer sector, first calf heifer sector. Make sure we're getting the right nutrients to the right animals. And from a nutrition perspective or a mineral nutrition perspective, make sure we're dealing with a year-round mineral feeding program that changes with the requirements of the animals as those animals go through their yearly calendars. And again, from the alternative feed side of things, if you're looking to move into alternative feeds on a more consistent basis, answer some of these questions before you do it. Is the feed available? Is there a consistent supply? Can I get competitive pricing? Do I know the nutritional value of the feeds I'm looking at, and where can I put them in my program? What role do they play in that program? And can I store and handle them? And if you're really going to make the economic use of these products, can I store them when the supply is abundant and the price is cheap? And with that, I will end, and I will give the controls back to the team and answer any questions that people might put in through the chat section.
Perfect. Thank you, John. For those of you who have not already done so, you may type your questions now in the question box in the bottom right-hand side of the control panel. And if we don't get to your question during this time, we will ask John and answer them with a follow-up email. So just one question here while we're waiting for some other questions. Do you see any issues with weed seeds and screenings that maybe aren't getting digested and then causing weed problems where they've been fed?
Exactly, that's one of the age-old issues with raw screenings. You're potentially collecting screenings from a wide geographic areas. And some people would say you're collecting other people's problems and you're bringing it home. And that's an issue, certainly. I guess you have to think about that in terms of the agronomics of the crops that you're growing where you're spreading that manure.
Okay, follow-up question there. Is there really much to any value in feeding kochia seed, and do the cons strongly outweigh the pros?
Kochia seeds or kochia itself?
I think it was kochia seeds. Yep, seed.
That would be a question that, to be honest with you, has me stumped. I've never been involved with feeding kochia seeds. certainly feeding kochia from time to time in drought situations comes into play. The big issue with that, besides digestibility and to some extent palatability, is some of the anti-nutritive factors in it, particularly oxalates and the potential for binding calcium. So you do have to look at calcium supplementation a little bit more closely when kochia is being fed, but kochia seeds would have me stumped.
Good, we finally stumped you. So how much does pelleting offset the low cost of some of these alternative feeds? Is the ROI worth it?
That is another issue that you really have to look at. When you look at the nutritional value of the pelleted grain screenings, I would put it about 10% higher, maybe 10 to 15% higher than the raw grain screenings. So you're getting more nutritional value out of those pelleted products. When you start to look at some of the fortified products that brings in, for example, you might bring in some barley or some wheat to get a more consistent energy source, and the lentil screenings to look at some protein coming in, then you get a much higher boost from those fortified grain screening pellets. But definitely the raw grain screening products, you do have to look at in that area of 10 to 15% reduction in availability. Very much like I showed in that work from a number of years ago of Steve Pilot's master's program.
Okay, I think we'll take our last question. Is there anyone who's analyzing the cost of removing straw off of cereal fields? Lately, agronomists have been telling grain farmers that they are giving away piles of nutrients by allowing cattle producers to buy or sell with straw. This asker believes that there is value being taken, but they have elevated that far above its realistic cost. And grain farmers are wanting to get a whole year's worth of fertilizer dollars for a couple bales per acre. So I guess the question is there anyone analyzing the cost of removing straw?
Well, again, that's a question that I don't have an exact answer for, but I would think that there are a number of companies that are out there that individuals are working with, grain farmers are working with in terms of consulting agronomists that have spreadsheets that look precisely, well, not precisely, but have the ability to look at that question and compare the nutrient value of that straw as a fertilizer versus the potential for value being sold as straw to livestock producers. But certainly if you look at the availability of straw, when you look at producers that are looking to buy straw, it's becoming a scarce commodity. And it seems that the answer that a lot of these producers are getting, cereal grain producers are getting, is that there's more value to leaving it on the field than selling it as straw.
Okay. Yes, follow-up definitely has made it hard to find roughage. So yes, we've seen that a lot too with our clients. Okay, if you have another question, pop it into the question chat and we will follow up with you later. But at this time, I would like to thank everybody for joining us for the first session in our webinar series. And of course, a special thanks to Dr. John McKinnon for kicking us off with this presentation today. There will be 3 more sessions over the next 3 Wednesdays at noon. If anyone has any further questions regarding this topic or other agriculture related questions or inquiries, please contact your nearest Saskatchewan Agriculture Regional Office or the Agriculture Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377. Thank you again all for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your presentation, John. Appreciate it.
So we're all good?
You bet. I think we have one question maybe in the chat that didn't get answered. So John, if you don't mind, I'll just email that to you.
Sure. Yep.
We have
Just
another
a
one.
question about flax.
Yeah, we have one about flax screenings and one about flour. So
Just send them to me and I'll get back to you this afternoon.
perfect.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.